Indonesia engineered one of the most aggressive and fascinating industrial bets of the 21st century. The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Use its position as the world's largest nickel producer to force the entire global electric vehicle supply chain to its shores. For a while, it worked flawlessly. Western and Asian automakers alike panicked over raw material shortages, and billions of dollars flowed into the archipelago. But there is a fatal flaw in the strategy, and it is playing out right now in 2026. The battery market is shifting rapidly under Indonesia's feet. The grand disruptor isn't a new government policy or a competing mining nation. It is a change in battery chemistry. Lithium iron phosphate, or LFP batteries, held less than 10% of the EV car market in 2020, but by 2025, they surged to account for roughly half of the entire global EV battery market. LFP batteries do not use a single drop of nickel. Even more ironically, if you look inside Indonesia itself, over 90% of the EVs sold domestically in recent years are powered by these exact nickel-free LFP batteries. In this video, we are going to dive deep into Indonesia's nickel trap. We will explore how the LFP revolution is breaking Jakarta's downstreaming strategy, and why China is walking away with the very geopolitical leverage that Indonesia thought it was building. To understand the trap, we first have to understand the genius of the original plan. In 2020, Indonesia made a bold, highly controversial move. The government enacted a strict export ban on raw nickel, or the message to the world was clear. If you want our nickel, you cannot just dig it out of the ground and ship it home. You have to build the smelters, the refineries, and the battery factories right here in Indonesia. This policy, often referred to as downstreaming, was designed to pull the country up the global value chain. Instead of exporting cheap dirt, Indonesia would export high-value mixed hydroxide, precipitate or MHP, and eventually finished EV batteries. For a few years, Jakarta held all the cards. Nickel is a critical ingredient in NMC nickel manganese cobalt batteries, which were the gold standard for long-range electric vehicles. Automakers from Detroit to Stuttgart believed that whoever controlled the nickel controlled the future of mobility. Foreign direct investment poured in. Industrial parks in Morali and Weda Bay expanded at a breakneck pace. Indonesia was no longer just a mining jurisdiction. It was positioning itself as the indispensable bottleneck of the global energy transition. The entire Indonesian premise relied on one fundamental scientific assumption: that nickel would remain the undisputed king of battery metals. Nickel is prized because it provides high energy density, which translates directly into longer driving ranges. If you want an EV that can drive 400 miles on a single charge, historically, you needed a lot of nickel. But battery chemistry is not static. It is fiercely competitive. Enter LFP, lithium iron phosphate. For a long time, LFP was dismissed by Western automakers. It was heavier, had lower energy density, and was primarily used in cheap short-range vehicles or commercial buses. However, Chinese battery giants like CATL and BYD never gave up on LFP. They relentlessly engineered the battery architecture. They developed cell-2-pack technology, which eliminated the dead weight of battery modules and allowed them to cram more energy-dense LFP cells directly into the chassis of the car. Suddenly, the math changed. LFP batteries became incredibly cheap to produce. They have significantly longer life cycles, meaning they degrade much slower over time. And crucially, they are vastly safer. The much higher thermal runaway threshold, meaning they are far less likely to catch fire. By 2025, the impossible had happened. LFP technology evolved so rapidly that it began cannibalizing the market share, previously dominated by nickel-based batteries. Automakers realized that the vast majority of consumers do not actually need 400 miles of range for their daily commutes. What consumers actually need are affordable electric vehicles, because LFP batteries use iron and phosphate materials that are incredibly abundant and cheap compared to nickel and cobalt, became the ultimate tool for driving down the sticker price of EVs. By 2025, Chinese battery giants like CATL and BYD, whose dominance is heavily built on LFP tech, captured over 55% of the total global EV battery market. Tesla shifted its standard range vehicles to LFP. Ford and Volkswagen announced massive LFP battery plants. The industry effectively nickel-heavy batteries were relegated to luxury, high-performance, and heavy-duty vehicles, while LFP became the undisputed king of the mass market. For Indonesia, this was the worst-case scenario unfolding in real time. The world had found a way to bypass their strategic choke point. If you want to see the most glaring evidence of this strategic mismatch, you do not need to look at Europe or America. You just have to look at Indonesia's own domestic auto market. Indonesia has been aggressively pushing its own citizens to adopt electric vehicles. It's offering subsidies and incentives, and the public is responding. In 2024, domestic EV sales surged by 200%, hitting roughly 40,000 units. But here is the ultimate irony. Nearly 90% of those electric vehicles sold inside Indonesia were powered by LFP batteries. They are not using the nickel that Indonesia sacrificed its landscapes to mine. They are using imported Chinese LFP technology. Cars like the Wuling Air and various BYD models have flooded the Indonesian market because they are affordable. The local consumer base simply cannot afford the premium price tags associated with NMC-powered luxury vehicles. So, the very country that built its entire industrial future on the premise of a nickel-powered world is actively transitioning to electric mobility using iron and phosphate. This domestic reality exposes a massive mathematical problem with Indonesia's downstreaming strategy. The original hope was that local battery and EV manufacturing would absorb a large portion of the nation's nickel output, creating a self-sustaining, localized loop of economic growth. But the numbers simply do not add up. According to a recent report by the Energy Shift Institute, even if we assume a wildly optimistic scenario where Indonesia manufactures 1 million electric vehicles annually, that domestic industry would consume less than 1% of the country's total nickel output. Let me repeat that. Less than 1%. This means that Indonesia's nickel industry remains almost entirely dependent on global export demand. If global automakers continue their massive pivot toward LFP for mass-market vehicles, the demand ceiling for Indonesian nickel drops dramatically. Instead of being the indispensable heart of the EV revolution, Indonesia risks becoming a highly oversupplied commodity provider fighting for a shrinking slice of the premium battery market. This brings us to the geopolitical dimension of the nickel trap. When Jakarta initiated the export ban, the unstated geopolitical goal was diversification. Indonesia wanted American, European, and Japanese capital to balance out its reliance on foreign powers. They wanted Tesla, Ford, and Volkswagen to build gigafactories on their shores instead. Western automakers have largely hesitated. They are wary of the environmental, social, and governance or ESG concerns surrounding Indonesian nickel mining, which relies heavily on coal-fired power and poses severe risks to local biodiversity. Meanwhile, Chinese companies had no such hesitations. Armed with massive capital and state backing, Chinese mining and metallurgical firms swooped in. They built the industrial parks. They built the high-pressure acid leaching plants. They mastered the complex chemistry of turning low-grade laterite ore into battery-grade materials. Today, the vast majority of Indonesia's nickel processing infrastructure is controlled, financed, or operated by Chinese entities. Indonesia successfully forced the supply chain to move, but it simply moved Chinese supply chains onto Indonesian soil. The ultimate proof of this entrenchment arrived in 2025. CATL, the undisputed Chinese king of global battery manufacturing, broke ground on a staggering $6 billion integrated battery project in West Java. Alongside local Indonesian partners, this is not just a standard battery factory. It is a complete, end-to-end, closed-loop ecosystem. The project spans the entire battery value chain from captive nickel mining to chemical processing 2. An initial 6.9 gigawatt battery manufacturing plant, all the way to battery recycling. What this means is profound. Even in the nickel-based battery sector, China has completely ring-fenced the value chain. By controlling both the extraction of the raw material and the final high-tech assembly of the battery cell, companies like CATL ensure that the highest profit margins remain in their hands, not Jakarta's. China now dominates the LFP battery market globally and simultaneously controls the nickel-based battery ecosystem inside Indonesia. Indonesia played its best card, and China walked away with the pot. For Western investors, policymakers, and automotive executives, this presents an explosive framing. If you have been investing based on the narrative that nickel demand automatically translates into Indonesian strategic power, you need to update your models immediately. Chemistry innovation can destroy resource leverage faster than governments can build industrial ecosystems. We are seeing it happen in real time as LFP bypasses nickel. Furthermore, because Chinese capital is so deeply embedded in Indonesian nickel, Western automakers face a massive regulatory headache. Under policies like the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, VEHIC, LES, containing critical minerals extracted or processed by foreign entities of concern, which includes Chinese companies, lose access to lucrative consumer tax. Western capital is now looking at Indonesia and seeing a trap. A supply chain that is environmentally risky, increasingly bypassed by cheaper LFP technology, and so dominated by Chinese partners that it is effectively toxic for U.S. regulatory compliance. Asterisk. Make no mistake, Indonesia is not irrelevant to the electric vehicle future. The world still needs millions of tons of nickel for premium EVs, aerospace, and stainless steel. The downstreaming policy did create jobs and did force industrialization, but the original dreams, the idea that nickel alone would guarantee Indonesia undisputed industrial power, immense geopolitical leverage, and a monopoly on the EV future now looks incredibly fragile in an LFP-led world. The lesson here goes far beyond Southeast Asia. It is a warning about the energy transition itself. You cannot build a decades-long geopolitical strategy around a single chemical element, because technology never stands still. Indonesia bet the house on the mineral. China bet on the technology, the manufacturing, and the adaptability. And in the high-stakes race for the EV future, that is the difference between simply owning a resource and truly controlling the game. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand the deeper geopolitical currents driving the global energy transition, make sure to subscribe to Power Transition Asia. Let me know in the comments, do you think solid-state batteries will save Indonesia's nickel dream, or is LFP here to stay? See you in the next one.